and welcome. Today I am going to try and turn this lovely tablecloth into a cloak. Now I got this tablecloth at an antique mall and I really liked it because I really liked the bird motif we've got going on and all these really pretty applique embroideries of blue toned flower motifs and petals, and I think I want to try to turn it into a cloak. So I have draped it over my dress form in a manner that might be conducive to cloak making. I'm not sure whether I want to make this more complicated than just creating a hole at the top of this and then sticking my head through it and then making a cloak that way. It's really, really long, so this would be the sleeve if I end up doing that way. It has these cute little tassels on it. So I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do that, but that is the goal, is to create and turn this thing into a cloak. So I'll bring you guys along for the ride. So this tablecloth actually it's all bound at the edges in this kind of metallic braid. And it's like a metal thread that's really kind of scratchy, and I don't really think I want that up against my body, so I might actually end up taking that off. So I think that's going to be my first step, is removing this metallic gold braid. And as this seam ripping comes to a close, it is now time for the very nerve-wracking part of cutting the hole for my head. All right, wish me luck. Okay, so I have discovered a problem. Obviously, this is where I have cut the neck hole. The problem is that the shoulder seam, after I put it on my dress form, is about here. But the halfway point of the cloak fabric is here, which means that now this cloak is significantly longer on the front side than it is the back. I think it's about 4 inches-ish longer. So that is a problem. So I need to go ahead and figure out how to move this neck hole forwards. So what I think I'm going to do is, this is the piece that I've cut out. I think I might stitch this back together and then do some reinforcing on the inside and maybe make it look a little pretty so that I can move the neck hole from here, the tip here, to maybe more like here, and move the neck hole forwards. So what I've decided to do to fix this is I have this little remnant of black piping. So I'm going to put that in between the original hole ends that I cut and then the new piece, or the piece that I'm going to stitch back on. So that'll go around this edge and it'll look a little decorative and just be like a collar reinforcement. I am happy to report that that worked, and the cloak is now the same length on the front as it is on the back. So now I can go ahead and start moving on to the lining process. So that's what I'm going to do now. I have already cut and torn this end of the fabric to make sure I have a nice straight edge on the grain. The best way to do that is to tear the fabric the length of the way across. So I am now going to measure out the piece that I need to go ahead and make the lining. I'm going to have to make the lining in 2 pieces because this fabric is only 43 inches wide, and my cloak is, of course, 78 or something like that. I think it's 76 actually inches wide. So I'm going to have to do 2 lengths of this with a seam down the middle going through the lining of the fabric, but that's okay. So I'm going to go ahead and cut my 2 lengths of this, and then I can go ahead and start hemming each edge and apply it to the cloak. All right, I now have this little offcut piece of my paisley lining, so it is now time to consult the wall of thread. Most of this thread was my grandmother's or great-grandmother's. A lot of it I did not actually buy myself, so hopefully I have the right color to match this. When determining what color thread to use, it is always best to pull down a string off of the main hunk and compare that against your fabric. So I think of all of my options, this one is going to be the one that we're going to go with. Well, disaster has struck. I was lifting the cloak over the table so that I could go ahead and cut out the neck hole of this lining, and the neck hole caught on the underside of my table and ripped right down the front and down the back of the outer cloak lining. So I need to figure out how to fix that. I'm really upset and really bummed out. The saving grace, if there is any, is that this is 100% wool, and I can possibly fuse these rips back together by refelting the wool. I also have some double-sided adhesive that I'm going to try to put underneath the tears just to try to bridge the gaps. I'm really upset, but I can't go back and fix it now, so I'll just have to make do with what I can. So I've ironed down that fusible web, but I think what I'm going to do, since this tear is right along the front point, I'm going to reincorporate the tassel that I took off, and I'm going to place it here and stitch down one of the arms of the tassel over that tear, just to kind of help conceal it a little bit. And then the front of the cloak will have this tassel hanging down here. And then I've gone ahead and I've placed the ones at the back over the other tear, which is here. And I'll just have 2 tassels hanging from the back corners of the collar, which I think is a good plan. I wanted to reincorporate those tassels anyway, and I think that's the placement I would have chosen anyway, even if the fabric hadn't torn. So that is my plan now. I will go ahead and stitch those down and then cut out the neckline of the lining, which is what I meant to do in the first place, what I was trying to do. And then just bias tape this front neck opening, and then I'll be done. So that's the plan. Right after the tear happened, I told you guys that the saving grace to the problem was that this fabric is 100% wool felt. And so I could fix this tear by felting over the problem. And I'm going to show you how to do that. But let's pretend that this right here is my tear. So ideally, when you are mending a tear like this, you're going to use the same color thread as the fabric. I'm going to use a white thread here just so you guys can see what I'm going to do. But we're basically going to be using what's called the Henson stitch. It's very similar to a ladder stitch, if you guys know what that is, or it's sometimes called a blind stitch. But this one specifically, the Henson stitch, is designed for fleece and wool fabrics, and it was designed by Jim Henson when he was making the Muppets as an invisible seam for felted and fleeced fabrics. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my needle, I'm going to go about a 1/4 inch, or not even a quarter, maybe like 1/8 of an inch, or about 1/2 centimeter away from the very bottom of my hole. And I'm going to pull the needle up, and then I'm going to make a perpendicular stitch to the hole. So the tear is here. I'm going to stitch here very small, and I'm going to pull that through. Oops, I'm going to get tangled. I hate when that happens, don't you? And then I'm going to pull this through both sides. And the trick to this stitch is you don't want to pull it all the way taut just yet. You're going to wait till the very end to do that. And so now that I have my initial stitch, I'm just going to come up it's going to be a very small stitch, and I'm going to come up right to the side of that tear. And I'm going to pull through, and then I'm going to make another perpendicular stitch to the other side of the tear. And on the underside here, I'm just making very, very small little upward stitches, and that's called the ladder. So you kind of go parallel to the tear or the hole along the sides, and I'm going to do it very small. The smaller and finer you do, the more clean your repair will be. And then I'm going to go down to the other side, and I'm just going to repeat that all the way over, all the way up the length of the tear, just coming up on the same side I just went down, but just a little bit further up, and pulling through, and continuing down the other side all the way up until I finish my length of the tear. Now that I've reached the end of my tear, now is when I'm going to go ahead and pull this thread nice and taut. And you want to do it carefully, kind of bit by bit, so that you don't end up tearing your thread or tearing your fabric. But if you just pull and pull incrementally, your tear will pull together, just like that, until you can't even really see the tear anymore. Now, of course, you would knot your thread. And then what we're going to do, because this is the Henson stitch and not a ladder stitch, is now that this is all together, what we're going to do is we're going to take our needle and scrape the two sides of the felt together over and over and over and over. And sometimes you can use, if you have one, a pet brush. This is a pet brush I have that I use for other things. And you can just kind of just take the tips and pull the threads over your hole, and then flip it over and do the same on the other side. And basically what we're doing is we're just encouraging the nap of the fabric to cover our hole. And then once we've done that, you see it's almost imperceptible. You can still kind of see my threads a little bit just because I used a contrasting color. Now what you would do is you would press this nice and flat, and then your hole is pretty much entirely covered. And if you guys can see, I've already done that to the front edge of my tear here. This is where the tear was, and it's almost imperceptible. It's never going to quite completely go away, but it is very much better than it was before. And so now when I put the tassel back over this, it's going to pretty much completely hide or shield this tear. And so that's the Henson stitch, and that's how you can help mend a tear in your fabric, as long as it's felt or fleece or wool or something like that. I've hand stitched this bias tape all around the edge of the neck hole. I was originally going to use more of the interior lining fabric, but it just didn't go well enough. It drew too much attention to the collar, so I just decided to go with black instead. So I think all that I need to do now is I'm going to reattach this tassel. I'm stitching on a button to the front point of the collar and the back where I'm going to attach the tassels, because each of the tassels has a little loop on the top of it that can easily go through this size button. So all I'll need to do is just attach these buttons, thread the tassels through the buttons, and then I can call this done.